cloud. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to those coming in from time zones that are different than my own here in Chicago. I am Nafia Khan. I work with Hope Fair Housing Center, which a fair housing agency in a nutshell is a agency that specifically works with folks that are experiencing or might be experiencing housing discrimination. So we're a little bit different. We are not a direct service provider of housing. However, we work with people that are experiencing difficulties in their current units if they rent. Perhaps they are residents and they are experiencing discrimination through the lending institution and or housing industry like their landlord or a condo association for a variety of reasons. Could be that they have a disability and they're experiencing housing discrimination, could be a race-based case, that sort of thing. And so we're just here to provide some useful information for you all so that as you continue to do your work, you're aware of what at the federal and state levels, we have protections in place for folks that are experiencing this, and that you as somebody who is working directly with clients and or representing your organizations have the tools in your toolbox so that you're successful at advocating for the folks that you serve specifically. And for the purposes of accessibility, I'm going to turn my camera off. I want to make sure that everybody has ample room to be able to ask any other questions they want. Just want to make sure that you're able to focus fully. And if there's any other accessibility notes that you need, like for instance, I myself have ADHD and I'm self-disclosing this. One of my reasonable accommodations, for instance, is that I ask folks to talk slowly. As you can tell, I'm from Chicago. I'm a very fast talker. However, obviously, I'm well aware that we want to make sure that we're accommodating anybody else's accessibility needs. So please do provide any other access notes if you have any. I want to make sure that in the chat we are making sure that everybody's voices are heard, and frankly want to make sure that this is a productive discussion. So I will go ahead and just get started here. Again, my name is Nafia and I am with Hope Fair Housing Center. So for those that don't know Hope and or fair housing organizations in general, we are an entity that provides services throughout a service region, just like many of you, if not all of you on this call. We are here to mostly provide, as I mentioned, I am from the Chicagoland area. We mostly provide services to the first half of our county. So anything far north, like on the Wisconsin-Illinois border, all the way down to central Illinois. So on this map, and I'm just going to go ahead and do an image description. There's both a red set of the state that is labeled with all of the counties in the northern region of our state. And then we have some counties in addition to where Chicago is located. I'm sure you all have heard it's from Cook County, Illinois. We also provide services in a part of west suburbs of Chicago, as well as a little of the tip of southern suburbs. And so that is why there is a bunch of red on this page, and then there is some blue, because it just distinguishes where the majority of our service area is. So to that end, Hope provides, as I mentioned, we are responsible for supporting folks that are experiencing housing discrimination. And we do that in two different ways. We do education and outreach. Today is an example of that department's work. And the other department is our enforcement department. So throughout today, I will be referring to both of our departments at different points in the presentation because we do different things. However, we're trying to prevent discrimination from happening to folks that are experiencing barriers while in their home. And we're also trying to ensure that any laws that are being violated, for instance, by housing providers, that we are making sure we advocate for those clients so that folks can lift those barriers for those experiencing that discrimination. So fair housing agencies, just so those that are not aware, you have a fair housing agency likely that represents your county wherever you live. And if you don't currently have one, it is not completely unthought of actually to start new fair housing agencies, but they exist in every part of the country and they provide services very similar to those that Hope provides. And it's really incredibly important. I kind of gave you a little overview of what my organization does. But one of the things that is really incredibly important, as we know, that if we don't know our history, we are often doomed to repeat it. And so for that reason, I'm going to take you through just a snapshot of the history of fair housing. And again, as I mentioned, if anybody has any questions, if anybody has anything to add, or they find something insightful or wanted to talk further, please feel free to utilize the chat for that. So quick history lesson for those that don't know, the United States is not new when it comes to the country that provides some sort of guidance in regards to housing and housing standards. Our first piece of national level legislation that came from Congress and was signed into law in 1934 was what we call the National Housing Act. And this was the first law of its kind to ever address housing in the United States. This legislation also set up a system of the mortgage system. So like, for instance, talking through the fact that Americans can now apply for things like mortgages. They can go through the process of obtaining a home. And this is the way to go about that. Lending institutions' responsibilities, that sort of thing. Now, while this law is an incredible opportunity for Americans in the 30s to be able to purchase homes, there also comes with new legislation, there often comes with unintended consequences. And one of the biggest ones being barriers for Black people. Not a surprise, right? So one of the phenomenon that we very often saw, especially for Black families, was the active effort by the community to redline. And I know many of us on this call have heard that word redlining before. And essentially the actual textbook definition is when home loans are not able to get approved for folks wanting to live in a significant foreign-born population community or where minority members of community reside. So for instance, I'm just going to give you an example. My family are immigrants from Pakistan. And so my parents, when they first relocated, when they emigrated to the United States from Pakistan, they settled in a community that was predominantly Asian American in the north side of Chicago. However, when they wanted to try to purchase a home in that same neighborhood, again, keep in mind, this is predominantly made up of Korean community members. My parents were unable to obtain a home loan. However, when my parents were able to get together the money and they ended up trying to find homes in the north part of the city, which is the community is called Irving Park. It is currently a very highly gentrified community. They had absolutely no trouble having the mortgage company, the lending institution, and all of the various actors to support them to be able to approve them for a home loan in that predominantly white community. Again, it's just really incredibly important to note that redlining still actively exists, as we know, in many different ways, and all of the systemic inequalities that exist in our communities. So redlining started becoming a very, very common occurrence in the 30s. One of the other bits of information that's really interesting has to do with restrictive covenants. So if you talk to Black families, going back generations, many families will be able to show you right on their housing deed where it is written that their Black family would never have been able to purchase this home. Basically, restrictive covenants were essentially contracts that were prohibiting Black families from leasing, purchasing, or occupying a home. And it was typically very much in regards to houses. Specifically, it could have been a piece of property of any kind. But restrictive covenants kept Black families away from the housing market. Because again, when you're lured by paperwork that, it's legalese, right? So it's like already a barrier that exists for folks to be able to access the housing just simply because they don't understand what they're signing. That has a lot to do with the way that the restrictive covenants, again, that legal paperwork that sits in people's housing deeds even to this day, while it is not enforceable in 2022, if you talk to cities like the city of St. Louis, for instance, there are cities that are actively working with homeowners to actually go back to old housing deeds and to strike that language in a judicial manner to actually go through that system. So it's really incredibly powerful what happens when advocates come together. And again, for whatever it's worth, it may be symbolic, but just sort of talks about the very, very clear inequity for Black families that were attempting to purchase homes. Now, in addition to redlining and restrictive covenants, you saw the emergence of what we call predatory contracts. So this is where a homeowner, again, this is an African American community member who wants to purchase the home, they're essentially forced into and pressured into signing a contract where essentially they were not able to keep the title to their property until they made their last monthly payment. Now, as we know, because you are a consumer, if you are purchasing a home, part of the deal is that when you enter in that agreement, right, with the bank, a lending institution, all of the things, you have certain consumer protections. Well, for a family that ends up getting pressured into this predatory contract situation, think about the fact that now not only do they not have that consumer protection should something go wrong, but the government and or whatever entity it was that that person was borrowing money from to purchase the house now has pretty much all complete control over that person and their ability of being able to live in that home freely. The possibility of getting your home taken away was very real for Black families. And so this is just another practice that made it very easy for Black families to not access housing because the system, frankly, was not set up for them. And then, and again, housing discrimination we know is why I'm doing this job, frankly. Discrimination was very much something that people started talking about and advocates started gathering around, knowing that not only was this disproportionately impacting Black families that were trying to purchase homes, but future generations might be in this place where they will continue experiencing differential treatment based on their protected class. I'm not going to delve too much into this part because this is really Chicago specific, but just for those that don't know, little known fact that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. actually spent time in Chicago during 1966 through 1968. For those that don't know, the Chicago Freedom Movement is the name that's given to the local efforts here in Chicago, Illinois, for example, in making sure that housing and fair housing was actually prioritized by the government. And one of the memorable things that occurred, in addition to the King family moving into the west side of Chicago, in order to showcase the slum-like conditions of Black families' homes, Dr. King actually marched with protesters to Chicago City Hall at one point. And he even marched with the folks that were demanding it, again, local advocates for fair housing were actually demanding that real estate listings should be available to both Black and white families. I'll mention this a little bit later in our conversation, but organizations like Redfin are often have lawsuits against them. My agency actually recently settled with Redfin along with a lot of fair housing agencies in this country because Redfin also has been doing algorithm bias as part of their work. And so there's a lot of ways that this real estate listings are actually still to this day not fully available to Black and brown neighborhoods. So it's just really incredibly important to note that's something that leaders like Dr. King Jr. were fighting for. We're still experiencing these barriers literally decades later. So just wanted to share that info for those that didn't know. Finally, this is really the most prolific piece of legislation I wanted to mention in history. The Fair Housing Act is the federal law that agencies like mine are in charge of enforcing. This actually happened just at the tail end of the 1968. Dr. King was assassinated in 1968 at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. Really interesting for those that are able to visit. Very, very interesting experience getting to actually see the site at which Dr. King was assassinated. It's a very like telltale. So 10 out of 10 would recommend if you all have a chance to see it. It's really, really intense experience. Fair Housing Act was actually passed on the heels and signed into law on the heels of Dr. King's assassination, actually. So literally, quite literally, it took the death, which is just incredibly tragic. It took the death of a very prolific, what some might consider radical leader, for folks to wake up and realize this is a serious issue. Housing discrimination is one of the most single important key issues and the key wins that is needed to ensure freedom for Black community members. And so in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed into law the federal level of protection that we use at HOPE and all the other fair housing agencies, which is the Fair Housing Act. And it prohibits discrimination for folks that are trying to lease, rent, purchase, sell, or live in a home. And it's all tied to a person's membership in a protected class. So I just threw a lot of historical facts and historical information. And I know that history is not everyone's cup of tea. So do please, if you're interested in further talking offline about any of this stuff, or if you're interested in more info and resources, I'm happy to share those book recommendations and that kind of thing. Okay, so we talked about a little bit of the history, and so far we've also discussed a little bit about HOPE. But now we're going to launch into specifically talking through the definition and or what the heck fair housing really truly means and what protections do people have under federal law. People have the right to live where they choose. We believe at Hope that you also should have access to that housing. So we know that in this country and other places, affordable housing has been a crisis for a very long time. It just happens to be rearing its ugly head now because we saw during the pandemic the disproportionate impact that evictions had for Black and Brown families, for folks that utilize housing choice vouchers that were put out, for folks that have lost their jobs permanently. And even though they did receive maybe the rental assistance programs, they're still not able to keep their housing because now landlords and property managers are not willing to allow that person to use that rental assistance to seek housing and to to get access to housing. So we believe at Hope that because fair housing is what it is, we believe that people have also the right to enjoy the use of their homes. We also, as a fair housing agency, do not accept if someone is being unlawfully discriminated against, interfered with, coerced, threatened, and intimidated. And unfortunately, often for folks that are experiencing housing discrimination, they are facing all, if not some of those injustices, right? So you may be discriminated against because you are a housing choice voucher, or what we refer to as somebody who used to participate in the Section 8 program for subsidized housing. You may be being discriminated against because you are a single mom and you are trying to find a place to live where your child can live with you. And the property management company says, nope, we don't allow children to live here. That's a protected class. And again, you may also be experiencing threats and being coerced. For instance, I know that we get sexual harassment fair housing complaints sometimes, and maybe someone is coercing a person to do a sexual favor in order to have access to the secure housing that they need. Like, these are all tactics that are very, very much discrimination, and they are disproportionately impacting those that are calling our lines, for instance. I'm really hoping that they can get some justice. So the Fair Housing Act, as was just mentioned, talks about protections for people based on their membership in what is called protected classes. So essentially there is federal, and depending on which state you live in, there are additional protected classes. I'm just simply highlighting the federal level ones as well as Illinois, because I live in Illinois and I typically provide support to folks that live in the state of Illinois. However, at a later date, we are actually going to have future presentations specific to fair housing rights in other states. So definitely tune in for that. Thanks to Lynette and Jesse. So federal protected classes, again, this is what the Fair Housing Act talks about, right? Race, disability, if you're being discriminated on based on your sex. Things like sexual harassment, sexual orientation, and gender identity, for instance, are actually also included in federal protected classes. Thank you. Thank you to the Biden administration for including sexual orientation and gender identity. And by the way, that was only done in sexual orientation and gender identity were only just now added in 2021. So it's really important to talk about the fact that laws really need time to, states and federal level protections in all states across the state, of the United States of America. Just because we're living in 2022 does not mean every state has the same protections. So just kind of keep that in mind. National origin. So this includes undocumented folks. So there's this, again, 100% valid fear that if you report a fair housing discrimination complaint, that you might be potentially deported, because if you're reporting to a government agency like HUD or your local human rights authority, that you could potentially be found out because you are an undocumented American. Well, that luckily is not the case at the federal level. You are protected under fair housing law, that you are absolutely empowered to file a fair housing complaint, even and especially if you are undocumented, for instance, or an immigrant or refugee. Color, religion, and familial status is also protected classes. Familial status, for those that are a little confused about what that means, basically it means like if you are a parent, for instance, and you are looking for housing and or you reside in a community where you live with your children, for instance, or even intergenerational households, you cannot be discriminated against because you are living in an intergenerational household and you're being discriminated against. Perhaps you are a parent trying to look for housing and or obtain housing because you have kids with you. Those are all protected classes. Illinois is interesting because in addition to the federal protected classes, we have a couple of unique categories that not every state has. Again, at a later date, I will go through some of these additional protections at a different training. But in Illinois, we have what we call order of protection status and military status. So this is really unique because this specifically speaks to DV survivors. So for instance, if you are actively fleeing domestic violence in my state, you have additional protections at the state level. There's the Illinois Safe Homes Act and an additional opportunity at multiple state levels, specifically like in the Illinois Human Rights Authority, like the Illinois Department of Human Rights that enforces our protected classes. We actually, like our state laws, the entity that actually monitors the compliance of that state level protections, DV survivors are included in that. So domestic violence survivors are protected under housing laws. We also have what we call military status. So regardless of if somebody is an active duty, inactive duty, veteran, or current service member, or leaving the service, you cannot be discriminated against for it when it comes to housing. So that's really incredibly important. I'm very grateful that I live in Illinois in the sense that I have the opportunity to let people know about the fact that DV survivors are protected for housing, and then military members. It's just really service members. It's just incredibly important that not everybody has that option. And just the fact that we are literally able to provide that for folks is a huge, huge deal. I'm just gonna do a little quick time check. We're already almost at the half hour. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna try to breeze through this side of things. I wanna make sure that I don't take too much time on the nuances and really just kind of giving you a little bit of everything. So again, summing up so far, we talked about the protected classes. We've done a little bit of history, and we talked a little bit through HOPE services. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, what happens when someone actually calls you at HOPE? Like, what is the process that a fair housing agency uses to evaluate if someone's being discriminated against? Well, we have a very, quick intake process, which basically, when somebody calls and is trying to tell us that they're being discriminated against, we have our intake specialist, a very awesome woman named Rose. And Rose takes down their demographic information. She gathers any sort of documents or any evidence that that person provides us so that we can build a case potentially of housing discrimination. I want to point out that although we're not solely, we are not solely limited to those helping in our service area, like sometimes, for instance, let me just give an example. Although we don't provide exact services in the proper city of Chicago, so like the first map I showed you had a bunch of red spots and then blue spots. We don't provide services throughout the entire city of Chicago because a different agency handles the physical city of Chicago. That does not mean, however, that if someone is experiencing this the situation, that if our sister agencies are, just very busy right now and they have a lot of cases they're already working on, there might be exceptions to that rule. So it's not a hard and fast rule that just because you don't live in a certain service area that you automatically get turned away or something. We always make sure that we provide referrals, and if that entity cannot do it, then we will take those cases on. So I just wanted to let folks know. So basically, when somebody gives us their information, we then have to take it to our complaint committee. So every Thursday at 2 o'clock, our enforcement staff meets, and we basically go through every single intake that comes through. We review the information and the facts of the case, and that's when our enforcement team has to decide, does this necessitate a fair housing complaint, and what do we do next? There have been times where the information that person has provided does not necessitate the level to a fair housing complaint, as in we cannot file a fair housing complaint based on the information we have and there's not enough evidence. Then we provide a referral to, it could be a fair housing lawyer, a separate entity that specifically deals with folks that might be experiencing discrimination, like specifically helping, like I know one of the entities that we often refer people to is a sister agency that handles specific like tenant disputes. tenant and landlord disputes, for instance, because those are completely separate, right? If they're like, a housing maintenance problem, that has more to do with tenant landlord disputes. So we're very, very specific about the kind of cases we take, because we don't just want to give people inaccurate information. We want to make sure people have the resources that they need, but also we are a fair housing agency and not a housing provider. So just kind of keep that in mind. Once that complaint committee meets and decides which action it's going to take, we then have to decide if we're going to do testing or not do testing. Think of it like a secret shopper at a retail store. We want to be aware of the type of environment that these property management companies or the landlords might be, really setting up for these home renters and for home buyers and for folks that are residing in these places. We want to see if there is a differential treatment happening for folks, for instance, in different protected classes. So I'll just give you the example of somebody who is experiencing race-based discrimination. We will literally have somebody who, by the way, this is a paid position. This is like basically you get a stipend for doing this. They're not considered employees of our agency. They have to be a neutral party. We basically have folks apply to be testers. And essentially, if we're testing for race, for instance, that person might make a phone call to see an apartment on a Monday afternoon at 2 p.m. They have a backstory. They have a very, thorough financial assessment that has been done. Like we go through, like, they could qualify for 3 times the rent and all of that. Well, to do a race-based discrimination, we'll send out that individual who happens to be white on that Monday afternoon at 2. And if that person is successful in getting that appointment and, going in, they get to actually have like a checklist. They know exactly what kind of information to look out for. Is that person offering you water? Is that person answering your questions? Do they give you a rental application at the end of the tour? That kind of thing. That sort of situation. And then 2 days later, we might have the black tester go out. And again, we are controlling for the same information, but maybe that entity is having trouble, scheduling an appointment because they keep making excuses and saying, oh, well, that unit's already been available, or, oh, I'm sorry, but I just had a lease sign on that property. Lo and behold, we go on Zillow.com and that property has still shown that it's still open. Like there's just a lot of different ways that we can use testers, because this is a third party that is testing specifically property management companies and determining if there is differential treatment happening between that white tester and that black tester. Now, there are times where our enforcement team does not need to test. Like if we have enough investigation material to be able to, for instance, there's witness interviews, or maybe we have done a lot of extensive property research, which we already do a lot of the time. Like our enforcement team is amazing at what they do. They've been doing this for a very long time. They know what to look out for. We also do that non-testing investigation because sometimes we don't need to go through the whole entire process. And keep in mind, testing isn't cheap either. I mean, yes, we receive government funding from HUD, but think about how many different situations we might come encounter with that we know we need to do testing, but we frankly have to wait until our budget allows for it. So it's just incredibly important right now that, not only are we now going to be switching here at Hope, we're like not just doing complaint-based testing now, we're actually also looking at systems investigation, which really, think about it, we know that systems are broken, right? So in order to make sure that there's very lasting change in our communities, we got to work at the systemic level, which really means, if we know that there's, for instance, real estate appraisal bias happening. We just are in the middle of this project that we started where folks, we're seeing undervaluation of Black families that are trying to get their homes valued for appraisers. Black families get very significant lowball evaluations of their homes compared to white families. And so we were engaging in real estate appraisal bias testing. So it's just really incredibly important to note that testing is very effective in fair housing cases, but it's not the only way to collect information. So now we're at the very final step, which is we're going to analyze what evidence we have. We may use the information and we realize, okay, we don't need to take this to court. We can literally just bring together whoever complained about the discrimination situation. We put together our staff together, and then the respondent or the entity that person is having lodging that complaint against, we just sit down and come to a reasonable agreement on what they need to do to rectify the situation. But yes, there are times where a housing provider doesn't want to do right. maybe the complainant continues to experience housing discrimination even after they're being communicated to about their rights, and the entity still doesn't want to treat them well. Well, we do have to go to court sometimes. And we do have to file with the Department of Housing and Urban Development sometimes. We often here in Illinois partner with our Illinois Department of Human Rights, so the state level protectors of fair housing laws. We have to also often go to them too, because we can easily file at the state level instead of having to go all the way to the federal government. As we know, processes vary on which level of government you work with. And so it's not a guaranteed thing that if I file with the federal housing, with the federal level entity, that I'm going to necessarily get my case heard quicker. So just important to note that HOPE is not just the only fair housing agency. We are somebody who actually also provides protections for folks that may also be needing additional help, like for instance, at the state level, they may want to file under national origin at the federal level, but then maybe they want to file under ancestry in Illinois. So it's just incredibly important to note that you have a very wide variety in your states of how you can file fair housing complaints. And again, at a later date, I will make sure that I provide those additional protections from different states so folks can join in and learn a little bit about that. Now we're coming up a little bit closer to our time. I just want to make sure that I run through the most important highlight. In the United States, in addition to race-based discrimination, we have a huge issue with discrimination against disabled people. Unsurprisingly, just because the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in it was signed into law in 1990, it does not mean that in 2022 that everything is accessible. It does not mean that people with disabilities are not still experiencing issues, for instance, having the ability of being able to put a ramp in to be able to access their house. For folks that are experiencing discrimination that are unable to secure accessible parking spots in their unit, next to their unit. So we at HOPE, I would very easily say more than half of our fair housing complaints have to do with reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification requests. So a reasonable accommodation is basically like a change in a policy so that a person with a disability can also have the same opportunity that a non-disabled person experiences. So like, for instance, one of the ones that we always get questions on / requests on is service animals. For whatever reason, there's this, I don't know why, but there's this understanding or some kind of really like myth that support animals are pets and that service animals are just pets. They're not actually needed. That's not a thing. 100%. It is the law that people with disabilities are absolutely able to utilize a service animal, emotional support animal, in order to live independently. This has nothing to do with a pet, and you cannot charge people extra money as like a pet policy to allow them to have a service animal, because pets and service animals have completely different jobs. Accessible parking spots. This is another challenge we are still experiencing in 2022 at HOPE. There is a lot of misconceptions that me as a property manager and or a landlord, I just have to have any old parking spot for any old person. It doesn't matter as long as it's specifically for a certain tenant. That's not true. For somebody with a disability, depending on what your disability is, you need a wider space. And it's not a good idea to just say, well, I just need, yes, there's plenty of parking for this person. I don't know why they're complaining about parking. Well, there's a reason why we have the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act to protect disabled people, because they're still experiencing very, very basic rights being violated, such as their right to be able to access accessible parking spots. And this is just an example. Keep in mind, these are just some examples of that change in practice so that people with disabilities can enjoy the full use of their housing. A tenant that may have a mental health disability, we get this pretty often actually for folks that have never worked with people that are tenants with mental health disabilities. when it starts to, like, for instance, if somebody has is experiencing a crisis situation and they are, for instance, very loud, and they are experiencing like a very significant mental health crisis, and there are residents that are getting spooked by them because maybe they have never known somebody that is experiencing mental health symptoms because of their mental illness. That, landlord must work with Hope, for instance, to provide a reasonable accommodation. That may look like the tenant getting support for their mental health disability and not just getting blanket evicted every time something happens. So we really here at Hope deal with a lot of these reasonable accommodation requests. These are just some, not all of them. But we really want to make sure that the right to housing is protected, because we at Hope believe that housing is a human right, and we do everything in our power to make sure someone's ability of being able to live independent living is fully respected, honored, and followed through with the law. So that's reasonable accommodations. Another note, this is something that is not at the expense of the tenant or the owner. So if you are the person that is, for instance, let me just give you an example. If I'm a renter, if I'm a tenant, and my disability is in a space where I am requesting a service animal, like I have a physical disability or I have a chronic illness, for instance, and I need that support animal, that is on the property manager to grant me that. I do not have to pay for that as like a pet policy fee, all of that. A reasonable modification, on the other hand, is something that you're basically asking the entity to permit you at your own expense, modify existing premises. The best things I can tell you is things like bathroom grab bars. We see this all the time for, our grandparents, for instance, that as people age in place, we want to be able to live independently. So we stay in our homes, and that does require we need to have things like grab bars installed. Widening our doorways. That's something a very simple, but like really sometimes can be expensive and cost prohibitive for folks. Also, the biggest one that we still have issues with, yes, even in 2022, is to have folks understand the need for ramps and the fact that, yes, I am a property, like I am the owner of a condo, and I should have a wheelchair ramp to be able to move around in my community, like in my own unit and into my unit. That's a huge problem even in 2022. Again, these can be very expensive and costly projects. We actually just get started on a home modification program that Hope, actually my agency, led, and we were able to provide people, I think it was up to like just under $2,000 to be able to do any modifications that they needed. So lots of nonprofits provide these services. Like they work with contractors and will, work with a client who has a disability to ensure that that person has what they need. So that's really important, right? We want to make sure that people have the best resources possible so that they can advocate for themselves. But also, it is our job under the Fair Housing Law to make sure that their rights aren't just being violated, but they also are engaged with that property management company, with that condo association, perhaps the realtor, whoever this is that is, probably committing. I'm not a lawyer, and full disclosure, everything I share with you is not legal advice. We're a fair housing agency, not a legal firm, and so we work with lawyers to ensure that people's rights are being honored and being followed. So that being said, in addition to disability discrimination, we at Hope and other fair housing agencies also experience what we call disparate impact cases. And a disparate impact, in a definition like textbook definition, it's when there's a policy that seems like it's pretty even-handed, like it's neutral, but then when it's actually practiced, it has a greater negative impact on one group than another. And this is no more prominent in one of the most common practices we see, which is arrest and conviction record status discrimination. Now, we know that under federal law, right, we know that arrest and conviction record status is not a protected class. However, if someone is screening for history on your record, and specifically on arrests and convictions, depending on what and how they are screening, they may be violating your civil rights. So an example like this would be if somebody, for instance, tells you, well, in my unit, say for instance, you're renting, there are no time limits attached to it. So They're literally saying in their lease or their agreement that anybody in that household that has a criminal history cannot live here. But they're not offering any look back period. They're not telling you about the minimum look back period. They're just straight up telling you that any history of criminal history will get you diddly squat. That's one kind of problematic practice. The other problematic practice we see, and this is something that Hope has taken upon itself actually to sue. We just settled a major lawsuit with a pretty large conglomerate property management company because they were discriminating against a person who didn't have any kind of conviction, but he was just simply arrested at one point. And so again, you know, somebody that said something in their paperwork and their housing lease, for instance, that says, never, we do not house anyone with an assault or bodily injury charge. Well, if you just tell someone straight up that you will not accept anybody with any kind of charge on their record, well, that's considered what we call a blanket ban. So blanket bans can be dangerous because one, we know that Black and brown folks are incarcerated at a much higher rate and are arrested at a much higher rate than white folks. And to that end, we know in the fair housing world that that also creates systemic barriers for folks to be able to, one, obtain housing, and two, to maintain housing. So that's really problematic in the civil rights world. Unreasonably long look back periods. Oh my gosh, you'll appreciate this. So the case that I just talked about, the one that had to do with a man that was being discriminated against because of an arrest that never led to a charge, by the way, like a conviction or anything, never served any time for it. Doesn't matter, because even folks that are serving time or have served time, even they have rights. And yes, people have to follow that. The gentleman who we just settled the case on behalf of, he was told by this property management company that we sued that, quote, our look back period is 0 to 99 years. Like literally, they told him that it is their policy that they look back up to 99 years worth of someone's criminal history. So if that doesn't say everything you need to know about where we're at in 2022 when it comes to fair housing, then that's what it is. Just wanted to share that because we were just stunned on our enforcement team. We're just stunned like that this is something that's actually being practiced. And surprise, surprise, when we tested those properties that management company owned, well, no surprise, we saw that across the board. So there's a lot of, you know, changes in the laws, as we know. I just wanted to talk through a law that actually just did a unique protection in Illinois that our governor just signed into law and will be in place in January 1st. So again, I just wanted to show this because I think it's cool that in states like ours, and you know, even in places like DC, like Washington DC even has this source of income protection. But in Illinois, I just want to share that our state just recently passed what we call source of income protection. Essentially, what this means is that in state law now in Illinois, we now make it so that people that utilize housing choice vouchers, that receive child support, that receive alimony, that are disabled people that have Social Security payments they use to pay for their housing, any old number of ways that you receive a legal source of income, as of January 1st of next year, you are protected under housing discrimination law in Illinois. So lots of people, like almost 100,000 housing choice voucher participants in Illinois will be protected. They can no longer be turned away by landlords and property management companies because they have a housing choice voucher to help pay for their bills, including housing, right? One of the other things we experienced during the coronavirus, right? There's a lot of people that needed the rental assistance to cover their bills, especially like during the pandemic. Unfortunately, there are landlords, some of them, that made it really difficult for folks to apply for those and would claim that they don't take it, that they will not accept that rental assistance because there's a stigma associated with receiving that. Well, in Illinois, effective the 1st of the year, we don't have to worry about that because we can actually challenge in court landlords that try to discriminate against people using rental assistance. So this is going to be huge for a lot of folks. We know that DV survivors and military members, right? Military service members are protected under state law already. However, now if they're utilizing their housing choice voucher, it's like the VASH voucher, the Veterans Administration gives it to, it's a program through the Veterans Administration Department. And basically that military service member, for instance, now who's receiving that voucher can also not be discriminated against. So we're just really thrilled that Illinois is now joining 19 other states and local jurisdictions that have source of income protections. And also just kind of a note, there's lots of states that are still trying to pass this. And it's just really, really incredibly important that we mention that, because that's something that's happening across the country right now. We're almost at time, and so I'm just going to super quick talk a little bit about a disparate impact case, just to give you all an example of like a real life case that Hope took on that is a nationally recognized standard now for what we call disparate impact cases. Remember I told you that disparate impact is when there's a policy. Yes, Evangeline, I will, just to answer your question, I can absolutely provide Lynette with a list of the other places that have source of income laws, just for you all to know. That's a great idea. Thank you for that. Let me drop that down right now. Thank you. So while we're talking about disparate impact, one thing I wanted to note is that Hope has actually successfully and otherwise sued municipalities even for violating fair housing law. One way to do this is to take things to court, right? To actually hold an entity accountable. So what happened is that in the city of Peoria, which is where I went to college at, it's in central Illinois, about 3 hours south of Chicago. There is a city called Peoria. There's a Peoria, Arizona, and a Peoria, Illinois. So just wanted to clarify. So city of Peoria in Illinois, they essentially had this practice where they started deploying, they call them nuisance abatement vehicles. But as you can tell, they kind of low key look like a military vehicle. So essentially, and as you can tell, it says the word armadillo on here. So it's just like the name given to these things. They're called armadillo vehicles. The thought process at the city council level and with the police is that having a nuisance abatement vehicle in neighborhoods in the city will prevent bigger crimes from happening, because there's this like part of one of the models is like police presence and more attacking some of these lower level things like nuisance and crime-free ordinances will eventually lead to bigger successes, like getting rid of drug and gang like the threats of gang and other public safety things, like will somehow be like wiped off if you have nuisance abatement vehicles in your community. Well, what happened that Hope intervened in this case was they would, so I hear, yeah, thank you, Lynette. So exactly, so basically we noticed here, thank you for that, they would park those vehicles in public housing parking lots in Peoria. So exactly what Lynette said. They started deploying these vehicles specifically to what were mostly Black neighborhoods. For instance, in complexes, for instance, where there are public housing, like in folks that are utilizing like the housing choice voucher and living in subsidized housing. So we noticed that there was like a pattern of this. So it was like continuing to be in predominantly the west side of Peoria, for instance, which is very much where African-American community predominantly lives, as opposed to the rich white upper class, what would be considered quote white upper class neighborhoods in a little bit further out in the city of Peoria. And so we saw this pattern and we did testing and we're noticing like this is happening everywhere in the city. What's going on? And so we sued the city of Peoria, and as a result, now the city of Peoria, like as part of that lawsuit, what essentially happens is we now held them accountable. Like now they have to do like essentially like quarterly report backs. They're now working, like they were able to work with Hope to come to a settlement agreement. Essentially, we were able to enter in a kind of what we call them conciliation agreements, but essentially what happens is when an entity is sued like a city of municipal government, they have to, in addition to undergoing training, they also have to pay stiff fines, for instance. They have to undergo a lot of policy changes, and we monitor all that. So we have a lot of responsibilities to monitoring these settlements as well. Just because we come to an agreement with an entity like a municipal government doesn't always mean that they hold their end up of the bargain all the time. So we really try very, very hard to work with them in advance, right? Like through education and outreach, so that we don't get to the level where we have to sue people. Because it's not fun to sue people. I mean, it's I get that it's the American way sometimes, right? Sometimes you have to take people to court to get people to comply with the law. But sometimes it's a lot of money. And keep in mind, we are paying our lawyers, even, like we have fair housing lawyers that we contract with, they are representing on behalf of clients and of Hope. So we are putting that money out on top of, all of this, and it's an all or nothing case in court, right? You either win or you lose. And so we try to avoid court when we can, because we really want to come up with amicable agreements with violators of fair housing law and the folks experiencing that discrimination. So we don't want to take everything to court, because that would be not only a drain on resources, but it's not always effective when somebody is continuing to do violation over and over again. So again, people that can be held responsible for violating the fair housing laws. Landlords, we already talked about, property management companies and owners, homeowners associations and condo associations. That's a very special, in the sense of very unique breed of folks. We often will get, especially when it comes to disability community discrimination, housing and condo associations have, for whatever reason, have an issue with following laws. So that's one entity we always have to look out for. Local governments. I talked a little bit about appraisal bias. Appraisers and lending institutions are another big one for fair housing violations, as you can imagine. So for instance, if you get a very low ball offer for when you're doing your valuation on your home, and then we are doing testing in that community and we find out that there's real estate appraisal bias happening, we can file suit against that appraiser, that lending institution. And one big one that I thought was really interesting when I started this job is newspapers. Anything in print, you see this for Craigslist, you see this for even Facebook ads, anything that talks about discriminatory language, like a ad that says mature adults only, they mean senior housing, but it's not considered, because there's an actual program where you can be listed as senior housing, quote unquote, designation. Well, any old property management company or landlord, if they're just willy-nilly putting it on Craigslist, no children allowed, well, that's discriminatory language, because that violates the fair housing law. And anybody affiliated with the following, or with the previous. I'm going to leave time for questions now, but just really quick, wanted to talk about statute of limitations. So as you know, because we are a fair housing agency, we are enforcing laws that we have on the books right now. In that mission, to fulfill that mission, we also have to file within what we call statute of limitations. We don't have endless time to file these cases. And so that's why we urge people to call our intake line immediately, so that the quicker that we know about an issue, the quicker we can, build that case, right, against that entity that's violating fair housing law. So if you want to file, and you can do this completely on your own, you don't need your fair housing agency to help you, but I would highly recommend you do. You can file with HUD 1 year after the discrimination either ends or starts. So if it started and it stopped, and then you have up to a year after that to file with HUD. You also, at the federal or state government level, if you have the State Department of Human Rights that's responsible for upholding your state protections, that statute of limitations it's 2 years after that discrimination occurs or ceases. So I just wanted to share that, because some folks sometimes don't need to necessarily use us to file fair housing complaints, but I think it's important to know what their rights are. And so while we're on this, does anybody have any questions or anything that they wanted more information upon? Please feel free also, if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself, please do feel free to include it in the chat section, because I'm more than happy to do that. Don't have any issues answering questions there. It's going to give folks a couple minutes to ask any questions or anything that I can clarify on.
Hey, this is Evie. I'm the National Housing Coordinator with Church World Service. And one of the things, and I joined late, so my apologies if this was covered earlier. But one of the issues that we run into a lot with the families that we work with is discrimination based on family size. We work, a lot of refugee families are really, really large. And so we have a really hard time. And some landlords, depending on the state and the community, but sometimes it's really strict. I mean, I know that I forget where it was, but the landlord said it was a 4-bedroom, and they said, no more than 6 people, which is, when you have a large family, you share room, your kids share room. So is there any advice on that? I found that the federal guidelines are very wishy-washy and not very easy to nail down when it comes to I guess, occupancy. especially when there's like minors, like kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a lawyer and I will not try to give you legal advice. However, what I can tell you is that each municipality, and especially state by state, there is definitely specific guidelines like through, and honestly, like the best resource would be to answer that question would be like the local public housing authority, because part of their responsibility while they are trying to, for instance, support people that are trying to access subsidized housing, they run into these issues all the time. So I definitely encourage a couple different things. One, I would definitely encourage that you contact like for that family that's experiencing that. I would make sure that I clarify what the local protections are as far as what like legislative level, because I know this happens in some municipalities. Like for instance, in Cook County in Chicago, advocates have to often go back to court and constantly get court cases and case law happening so that we could actually create like bills and stuff to address some of this stuff, right? Like, so like, for instance, in Cook County where Chicago is located at, and just using that as an example, I'm not trying to be Chicago centric, but like I know at the municipal government level and at the county level government, there are advocates that have been for a very long time trying to change that language so that, again, as you know, with refugees families, yeah, absolutely, they're intergenerational households. We're not talking about, one mom and her kids. We're talking about like sometimes even grandma and a mom and then multiple kids. And so absolutely, there are additional protections at the very like local levels, even that specific. So I would definitely encourage reaching out to the local public housing authority because they would be the experts in like what that local entity has as far as the county level protections. And absolutely, that could, depending on what the specifics of the situation is, could 100% be a fair housing violation as well. So if you want to reach, and I'll get your contact information, Evangeline. I don't mind getting back in touch with you and putting you in touch with your local fair housing agency, because they would be also the experts in telling you if this is a fair housing violation under their state laws and federal laws, or if this is more of like a situation where they need to exercise their right through their public housing authority to make sure that their rights are being protected. So I hope that offers a couple of solutions, but like I said, I will make sure I provide those resources with Lynette's help to you so that you can help that family. Because yeah, I can only imagine that's probably a very common occurring difficulty and barrier. I noticed that Colin, I hope that helps. Colin, I think you unmuted yourself. Did you have a question too? And if not you, anybody else, you can either unmute, or if you prefer to ask, just raising your hand or just kind of jumping in, please feel free to do either. Okay, no worries. And just for those that weren't here for the introduction, you just kind of missed a little bit. I do want to just, first and foremost, I want to thank you, Lynette, for coordinating all this, and Jesse. Both of you are just so much fun to work with. I'm so grateful for Church World Services and all the affiliates, because I think that y'all's work is directly impacting people's lived experiences. And I believe partnerships like these are so integral to making sure that refugee families are not only able to get the resources they need, but they're also able to make sure that their rights are they know their rights, but also that in whatever form they need, and Evangeline just kind of talked about this very important issue, right, of family size and occupancy laws and ordinances. That's a huge issue and a barrier for folks that are trying to obtain housing. And how are you going to tell a family of 6, for instance, that, oh, I'm sorry, but now we have to find 2 different units for you because a landlord is giving you trouble with a big family living in this one apartment? It's just, in today's day and age, also we're in the middle of a public health emergency too, on top of that. It's not exactly affordable to be able to buy housing, much less rent right now. And so I'm just so grateful for this partnership with Church World Services and all of you, because if it wasn't for the work that you all are doing, I couldn't do my job either. I just, again, want to thank Lynette and Jesse for this. And Lynette, just for those that are interested, Lynette just put in the chat a link to refugeehousing.org, which is the website, and then also included some additional information on how to get involved if you're interested in doing so. And again, Lynette and Jesse, just thank you so much for this opportunity. This is a really good, great group of people. I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording out here.